Hi, I'm Gary, and this is episode 64 of EV Musings, a podcast about renewables, electric vehicles, and things that are interesting to electric vehicle owners. On the show today, we'll be looking at hybrids. They generally get a bad rap amongst the EV community, but is that justified? Before we start, I wanted to make sure you've subscribed to the weekly EV Musings newsletter. It comes out every Tuesday, and it has 5 EV and renewable stories that we haven't covered on the podcast, an article to make you think, something to buy, and a link to the current week's podcast. A link to this is in the show notes. Our main topic of discussion today is hybrids. I was chatting with my father recently. He's seen my EV and he tends to look askance at it whenever I rock up at his place. He's a bit of a petrol head from his days as a youth working in garages and hand-grinding the valves on old Morrises and Wolseleys. We were in the kitchen making a Coronation Street ad-break cup of tea one day when he said, "So what about hybrids, son?" Because he's a caricatured Yorkshireman despite the fact he's actually from Ireland. "Good question," I said, and we had a discussion about hybrids. So let's start with what a hybrid vehicle is. Generally, a hybrid vehicle is, as the name suggests, a vehicle that has parts of several drivetrains installed, out of which a Frankensteined drivetrain has been created. Now, before we go any further, we need to get some terms right so that we all know what we're talking about. A mild hybrid is a petrol-driven car that has a small battery that is charged by the burning of fossil fuel and not by electricity. A plug-in hybrid is a petrol-driven car that has a small but slightly larger battery, which can also be charged by plugging it into a wall socket or a public charger. A self-charging hybrid is marketing nonsense and doesn't exist in the real world. If anyone tells you they bought a self-charging hybrid, tell them you have a plot of land 100 miles west of the Canary Islands to sell them. In a hybrid, the battery provides good initial acceleration, silent running, and some economy gains. There's nothing wrong with a hybrid per se. The current generation of Formula 1 race cars are hybrids. They have batteries and internal combustion engines, and, they're pretty cool. The idea behind hybrids is that the battery is used for some part of the driving, and it's more economical for the driver and better for the environment. Depending on the hybrid setup, the battery can be used exclusively until it has too little charge to drive the car, in which case the engine is used, or the engine and the battery work together to drive the wheels depending on the power required or the speed of the car. In some hybrids, the engine only charges the battery and the wheels are driven by the battery. In some hybrids, the engine can charge the battery and drive the wheels. In theory, a plug-in hybrid should be able to run completely on electricity for the full range of the battery. If you have a model with a semi-reasonable range, say 30 miles, you can also, in theory, do a commute or a full day's driving completely on the battery and recharge it from a plug when you get home without ever using any fossil fuel. However, in practice this happens far less than anticipated. A recent report suggested that plug-in hybrids are generally never plugged in and therefore run 100% of the time on petrol. This is both bad for the environment and bad for the wallet. In fact, many plug-in hybrids were bought because they had lower CO2 emissions and qualified for lower vehicle excise duty, specifically in the UK, and company car tax. They were literally just a tax dodge. The main problem with hybrids as a means of locomotion is that they're neither one thing nor the other. They aren't electric cars, unless you have a plug-in hybrid and only run the wheels via the battery, which is only charged via a plug, in which case why buy a hybrid rather than a full electric? And they aren't pure fossil fuel cars, as they do have a battery on board. The main issue that arises from this is that you end up, even with a plug-in hybrid charged only via a plug, carrying around a second means of locomotion, the internal combustion engine. This is both a heavy lump and it affects the efficiency of the battery. Just a little sidebar here, if you've ever bought the i3 Rex model with a range-extending engine, this is the same thing. The difference here is that the Rex is only used when the battery gets to a low state of charge, and the two-stroke engine cuts in to top the battery up. It's still a hybrid of sorts, but with a full-size battery and a little two-stroke engine to top it up. End of sidebar. Linked in with the previous point is the fact that with the battery and the internal combustion engine, you have two different systems to maintain. Your battery should need very little maintenance, obviously, and that's one of the benefits of a battery-driven vehicle. If you also need a full service every year, and oil changes and timing belt replacements and new spark plug or fuel injectors, this can soon add to the cost of running your hybrid. One of the bêtes noires for electric car drivers when it comes to hybrids, plug-in hybrids or PHEVs specifically, is the tendency to block rapid chargers while recharging. With very few exceptions, plug-in hybrids cannot rapid charge using a 50 kilowatt or higher charger. But with a lot of charge point operators providing units with both AC and DC options, it's easy for a plug-in hybrid to latch onto the AC and stay there several hours while it charges. A BMW X5 xDrive has a battery capacity of 21 kilowatt hours usable, but it's limited to 3.7 kilowatt charging by the onboard charger. To fill this from 10% to 80% on a rapid charger unit using the AC cable would take about 5 hours. For a Toyota Prius plug-in hybrid with a 7 kilowatt hour usable battery, this is limited to 3.3 kilowatt charging speed and would take around 2 hours to go from 10% to 80% on the same charger. The Peugeot 508 hybrid with a usable battery of 10 kilowatt hours would take around 3 hours to charge without the optional 7.4 kilowatt onboard charger. What these figures lead to is a tendency for PHEVs to charger hog. With many of the chargers today, only one vehicle can use a charger at any one time, even if there are multiple cables attached. The exception to this is the Osprey, formerly Ingenie network, units which allow an AC charge to run in parallel with a DC charge on the same machine. But if you're not an Osprey charger and you end up, say, at a BP ChargeMaster unit, which will statistically still be a single unit, and the car already attached to it is a BMW X5 xDrive, you could be there for a long wait. There are numerous solutions to this, but the main one is education of PHEV drivers not to charge on a rapid charge machine if your vehicle can't actually take a rapid charge. The Mitsubishi Outlander PHEV can charge on a CHAdeMO connection, but not many others can. They're all designed to be charged from slower 22 kilowatt or 7 kilowatt posts, not rapids. But linked in with this is the need to ensure rapid chargers also have slower chargers next to them for PHEV drivers. The Mercure Thame Lambert Hotel on the M40 near High Wycombe is an example of this. Unfortunately, this is not something which is as widespread as it is in countries such as Norway that generally have Type 2 posts close to rapid chargers for just this reason. Anyone who's watched a Bjorn Nyland road trip video will see that he always latches onto the AC charger if his preferred rapid is being used. Personally, I was going to get a hybrid initially. As a former Honda Civic owner, I was quite interested in the Honda Clarity plug-in hybrid. It seemed like a nice car, it was fuel efficient, and it was familiar to me. Naturally, I did some research on YouTube and ended up going down a bit of a rabbit hole. As part of this descent into madness, I encountered Johnny Smith on Fully Charged reviewing something called an e-Golf. No engine, just a batteries and a motor, and he quite liked it. Enough to later purchase one, I believe. And once I learned that cars could go full electric, I went down that road instead, and the rest, as they say, is history. But that does bring up the question of, why do people buy hybrids anyway? The obvious answer is because they want to be seen as being eco-friendly. The literature and advertising promotes hybrids as being more fuel efficient and better for the environment. Unfortunately, quotes, being better for the environment, end quotes, while burning fossil fuels is like saying the Bentley Continental GT at £157,000 is cheaper than the Bentley Mulsanne at £240,000. It's accurate, but misleading. One is cheaper than the other, but neither of them are actually cheap. They're both very expensive cars. As long as you're burning fossil fuels to move your car, you're not being eco-friendly. All you're being is less eco-unfriendly. There's a big difference. It's a little like saying, I'm only peeing a little bit into the swim pool, not as much as I was. The other reason people buy hybrids, apart from the marketing hype, is that they're familiar. Almost everyone who's learned to drive over the last 100 years has learned in a fossil fuel vehicle of some kind. They're familiar with the language, clutch, gears, petrol, diesel, etc. And running a hybrid gives them that familiarity. It also propagates the fossil fuel narrative about how we run our vehicles as long as possible, then head into a fuel station and pay exorbitant amounts of money to refill. The fact that there's a small battery that decreases eco-unfriendliness is just a bonus. There are also people who bought hybrids because they couldn't make the full battery thing work for them. Maybe they bought it a few years ago when ranges on EVs were lower than they are now. Maybe they had a long commute that couldn't be done on battery alone. All perfectly valid reasons for buying a hybrid then. Nowadays, however, those reasons are far less attractive. The battery range on the newer model hybrids has not changed dramatically, but the range on full battery electric cars has gone up in leaps and bounds. In our episode on the e-Nero last week, Andrew Till told us he was getting 264 miles of range from a charge, and was charging about once every week or two from his home charger. 264 miles is about the same as I used to get on my Honda Civic 2 litre in winter. There really is no reason nowadays to buy a hybrid instead of a BEV. So, getting back to my father, he nodded sagely when I told him that hybrids were a reasonable stepping stone for people unsure about EVs in general, but I reiterated to him that we should all really be driving electric cars. He nodded again, then a smug grin crept over his face and he thought about the next problem with EVs he could buttonhole me with. "So," he said, "what happens when they all plug in to charge at the same time? The grid won't cope." Rather than answer this, I flipped the kettle on to make tea right in the middle of the Coronation Street commercial break, just like millions of other people were doing at exactly the same time. "We'll be fine," I said. It's time for a cool EV or renewable thing to share with you listeners. Plastic waste is a huge problem around the globe. A lot of plastic is recyclable, but not actually recycled. But there is a huge subset of plastic which physically cannot be recycled. A lot of this stuff ends up being discarded into landfill, or worse, dropped into rivers and seas, making its way to the huge floating garbage patch in the middle of the ocean. But now, new technology is providing a potential answer to this waste. A group of researchers in the UK, China and Saudi Arabia, almost none of whom will be allowed into the United States by the current maladministration, think that they've discovered a partial solution. It's a process that gently heats the plastic in the presence of a metal catalyst, and this breaks down the plastic and produces hydrogen and carbon nanotubes that can be used commercially. It's still early days in the research, but if this could be commercialised and the energy for the microwaves produced from renewable electricity, this could be a game changer. And that's the show for today. Hope you enjoyed listening to it. If you want to contact me, please use the EV Musings Twitter account MusingsEV, or I can be mailed at evmusings@gmail.com. If you want to support the podcast and the newsletter, please consider contributing to become an EV Musings patron. The link is in the show notes. If you want a quick reference ebook to read on your Kindle, I wrote a little something called So You've Gone Electric. It's available on Amazon worldwide for the measly sum of 99p or equivalent, and it's a great little introduction to living with any electric car. At the moment, it's also free on Kindle Unlimited, or if you're in the Kindle Lending Library, so please check it out. Links for everything we've talked about in the podcast today are in the description. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe. It's available on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Please leave a review as it helps raise visibility and extend our reach in search engines. Thanks as always to my co-founder Simon. You know, he used to be a keen gardener back in the day. It was something he picked up from his parents. But being the adventurous type that he is, he wanted to try something a little more ambitious in the garden, something to extend the life of his rose bushes. I asked him what he chose to do. He said he asked his father the same question. We were sitting having tea one day when he said, "So what about hybrids, son?" Thanks for listening. Bye.